So I'm going to talk a lot slower than Josh. So I am the founder, CEO of Bionym. I'm also known as Karl the Martian. And so my background is in biometrics, and so I'm actually going to talk a lot from the perspective of what biometrics brings, but in the broader context of identity, and specifically consumer identity. And so consumer authentication today, as we've all gone through this before, things you know, things you are, and who you are or what you are, biometrics. And in the consumer space today, even though biometrics are making inroads, the reality is it's still largely things you know, passwords, PINs, passphrases, inane security questions. I remember reading a blog post where there was the revelation saying, when they ask you your mother's maiden name, you can actually put something else. It doesn't have to be your mother's maiden name. How do I remember what I put in there? I have no idea. So the reality is that as much as we hear about biometrics bringing so many new things to the table, not much has actually happened. You know, we have the iPhone with Touch ID, and but really there's very limited inroads when it comes to authentication. And so unfortunately we see a lot of the security world looking to biometrics thinking that they are going to solve that problem, the security versus convenience problem. And I'm really glad I went after Mance and Josh, because this problem comes up with so many different perspectives, and I know that biometrics comes up as often that solution, saying, well, if it's who you are fundamentally, if we're trying to authenticate that and we use biometrics, then we can make that totally convenient because we're taking user action out of the equation, and we'll just somehow use technology, biometric technology, as that silver bullet. But there are fundamental technological limitations, and I can tell you, as coming from the research world, where there's all sorts of new things invented every day, there are limits, and I can tell you within the next 50 years, we are not going to have biometric technologies that are 100% convenient when it comes to authentication. And the reality is that the problem of the security versus convenience is made even more difficult, exacerbated by fickle consumers in uncontrolled operating environments. And it's kind of the nature of the consumer experience is that it is largely uncontrolled. And I can tell you from the biometrics world, the term uncontrolled is your enemy. Capturing accurate biometrics, being able to accurately authenticate people from some signal coming off of their body, whether it's using imaging or something else. I can tell you in our case, we're using actually electrical signals off the body, EKG. Putting that into uncontrolled environments makes life very difficult, and we're no longer looking at a silver bullet, we're just looking at another tool with its own security versus convenience problem. So what I'm actually going to go through from here on in the presentation is actually it's kind of the philosophy behind, the thinking process behind how we created our product, because Bionym started purely as a biometrics company, just developing biometric recognition technologies, and we pivoted about 1.5 years ago to actually make a consumer product. And the philosophy behind that is what I'm going to describe now, which is we cannot completely eliminate the frequency associated with core human authentication processes. So we have, there's a lot of talk about the more passive ways, but when you need a high level of trust, and biometrics are usually seen to be as a part of that in the future, we cannot completely eliminate the friction. So how do we reframe this? And one thing we realize, and this is especially the case in consumer applications, is the problem lies not just with the friction of the specific authentication process, it's the overall burden, which is the friction times frequency. Just how many times do you have to do this throughout a day? And it's kind of ironic when you think about unlocking your phone, whether you're using Touch ID or you're using a password or a PIN. How many times do you unlock your phone a day? For me, it's probably 50 or more times a day. And think about why we're doing that. It's actually insurance for maybe the once a year or once every 10 years we say leave our phone somewhere in the taxi, or we forget it somewhere. So we're paying this price, and it's not just because of the individual friction of having to enter our password or put our finger down, it's the frequency. We have to do it so many times a day. And again, in most cases, in the consumer context, it is often it's insurance for very rare occurrences when we're talking about physical devices for the consumer. So how can we instead reduce the frequency if we know there's fundamental limits on the friction? So if we completely change the authentication paradigm, the fundamental problem is with this forced sense of synchronicity, authentication at the point of transaction. And so, we can think of, in the cloud context, tokens and cookies and things that have some sense of persistence. But when we're talking about transactions in the consumer space, a lot of that ends up narrowing down, and we get this forced sense of synchronicity between when the person has to prove who they are and the transaction that goes along with it. If you're talking about payments, entering a PIN with your credit card happens at the point of transaction. And so how do we decouple that? How do we decouple the action required for the authentication from the transaction that uses it? And the title of my talk was persistence, of course, and that's what we're trying to achieve. How do we achieve persistence to reduce frequency ultimately? And so really what it comes down to is redesigning the system to achieve asynchronicity. Asynchronicity between authentication and transaction. When you're proving yourself or when identity is actually being used. And so here I'm going to take a little bit of a divergence. So most of the talks, it's interesting, most of the talks I do are actually at wearable tech conferences, because this is the pivot that our company made, is we're making wearable technology. So here, wearable tech is actually going to be a divergence where you can see our thought process to how we're now thinking about identity. So wearable technology distilled, a lot of you know about the Fitbits, the Pebbles, and Google Glass, but here's one way of thinking about it. So there's really two parts to wearable technology. So one is seamless persistent sensing, which is the idea that you put something on your body, now you can have sensing, whether it be sensing signals from your body, or in case of Google Glass, you have imaging. It can be seamless and persistent because you're simply wearing it. And then the other side of it is low powerless wireless communication. The idea that this can be persistently connected, talk to other things, do it in a low power way so that you're not having to charge it every 3 hours. And those two things together are actually what wearable technology are. What it is, essentially, everything can be distilled down to this. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Bluetooth Low Energy, which is a relatively recent version of Bluetooth, is actually what largely enabled the sort of the latest upsurge in wearable technology. And so one of the obvious applications are fitness and health. And so somebody had a great analogy, which was the real benefit of fitness health for wearable technology is, if you imagine if you're a doctor and you want to know about somebody's well-being, it's much better to know in the field what's going on rather than just when they're sort of at the doctor's office. And the analogy was, let's say you're an airplane mechanic, much greater to get live diagnostics than just when the plane's landed on the ground. So this sort of seamless persistent sensing and low power communication enables that. But back to what I was talking before about synchronicity and asynchronicity, what's really great about wearable technology, it gives us signals, insight, and action can all be separated in time. You can capture signals whenever. You can have insight associated that can happen in the cloud, and the action associated with that can all be decoupled. Now, if we compare that to the problem that we had with authentication, tying the action of the user with the transaction, the problem we're trying to solve, we realize that wearable technology is actually giving us a potential route to reframe that. So what does a redesigned authentication system look like? So first of all, we want to establish a high level of trust using multiple factors. That's not going to go away. They can be passive, they can be active. But like I said before, to completely remove friction, I think is impossible. Biometrics are here to stay, but they will not be frictionless. So we use them to establish a high level of trust. But we leverage persistent sensing to maintain that trust without further user interaction. And we actually use the term persistent rather than continuous, because the goal is not necessarily to continuously authenticate, although that can be one component of it. The goal is to persist the trust. And so this is where wearable technology comes in. Use a trusted device, and when I say trusted, we're talking about things with secure elements, secure operating systems that tie signal sensing with cryptographic protocols. And so use a trusted device to seamlessly serve credentials without requiring any user interaction. And this is actually what we've done with a wearable product. It's a wristband that establishes trusted identity, but that establishing high level of trust is decoupled from serving credentials. As long as the trust is maintained when the person is wearing the device, credentials can be continuously served via Bluetooth without any user interaction whatsoever. You can design completely new user experiences surrounding identity because you don't actually require the user to take an action to serve a credential. So at the end of the day, and this has come up over and over again, it's not actually about identity, it's about the application. And this is something we talk about Bynum all the time. Don't get so caught up in authentication identity. At the end of the day, it's the killer applications that really matter. So, we like to say we make identity easy. In this audience, more specifically, it's identity authentication. We say make easy, so now what? And again, this is specifically in the consumer context. You realize really quickly authentication is not just a security problem. It is a general identity problem in all the different ways identity can be used. So by making identity easy, the scope of identity-focused applications significantly broadens, and this is what's really cool for us. Smart devices. So when I talk smart devices, I'm talking about anything that has some processing capability, has Bluetooth or some kind of connectivity, and is in the environment in some way, can communicate with you, have a new context in which to operate. Identity is that context. We provide identity, and how can that thing behave completely different because it knows who's in the environment? And this is not a security question. This is user experience question. So we're talking Internet of Things. Identity is actually a completely new context for Internet of Things, and what we say is the things that have actually really been missing. So the Internet of Things, again, if we distill it, what is it? It's about persistent connectivity and sensing. So wearable technology could be viewed as a subset of the Internet of Things, but more generally, if we're talking smart appliances, smart lighting, smart grid technologies, these are all Internet of Things that have persistent connectivity and sensing. So the sensing, the whole reason why these things exist is so that they can provide new context. The sensing, if it's a smart grid, you have something deployed that tells us about electricity usage at a specific node. That context makes those things smarter. So, but where we're talking about devices where user interaction is involved, identity is the ultimate context, right? And this is the thing that's really been missing, and in the identity space, we tend to be very focused on the things we already understand where identity is needed, identity is hard. But if you make it easy, imagine all the things that you can actually do, and that's what it's all about, is new applications, new user experiences. So one last divergence, which is privacy. And as soon as you actually remove a lot of the friction associated with identity, you realize, wait a minute, we've got a major privacy challenge making identity readily available. Hold on, if you have a beacon on your wrist that's transmitting identity, how do we manage privacy for this? So context, again, is important. Privacy is not about secrecy. Privacy is actually about control. How do you actually now put users in control of how their identity is being used, especially when you make it so easy and readily available? So by decoupling the human action, which is a person saying, I want to prove my identity by entering a password or a PIN or biometric, by decoupling that from wherever it's being used, greater trust is now placed in the system and the technology, because now they're saying, well, a lot of things can happen without the user sort of initiating action. So there's something called privacy by design, which was developed, I'm from Toronto, Canada, and in Ontario, the Privacy Commissioner developed this concept of privacy by design, which is foundational principles on how you design systems from the ground up to protect privacy. This is vitally important, obviously, in the identity space, because once you architect the system, if you try and compensate for privacy issues afterwards, good luck. You need to do it from the beginning. So in the context of what we do and wearable technology that can become a beacon of identity, there's two fundamental principles that we follow. So number one, everything has to be opt-in from a right down to hardware level, meaning that no device or service can know who you are without an opt-in, and that's not just a system level constraint, that's right down to the hardware. And so how that's actually done is, the model we follow is, every time you essentially pair your wearable authenticator to another device or service, you're actually creating a new credential. And by default, we do not have one unified credential. We create new ones for every application, and they cannot be cross-matched. And those can be revoked by the user. So if they say, I don't want to be recognized by this service, they can revoke it locally and don't require any sort of remote interaction to make that happen. The other part is the biometric part. Biometrics is probably the most personally identifiable information. The model that we use is that no device or service should know, outside of your sort of personal scope, should know your biometric. There should be no centralized database of biometrics. And every service you interact with shouldn't have to use your biometric to authenticate you. And this is where the trusted device comes in, is that the model that we use is that biometrics are used to unlock your personal trusted authenticator, but then that serves credentials that have nothing directly to do with your biometrics. So you're not spreading your biometric information everywhere. And so just to wrap up, I mean, I think the thing to emphasize here again is that we get caught up in, what are the solutions for the problems we have today. But I think at the end of the day, it's really about what can we enable that's new. And identity really is the context for the Internet of Things. And I think anybody in this space needs to recognize the power of new applications coming down the road. Identity has been the missing context for pretty much the Internet of Things the last 5 to 10 years as this stuff has been percolating up. And so the prospect is really profound. If every device, environment, and service provider knew the identities of those nearby, how would they behave differently? Again, we protect privacy, but if we make that readily available based on opt-in, how could they behave differently? And that's essentially a new potential world that we can create out of that. So ultimately, this is entering an era of hyper-personalization. If you think about what is your smartphone, your personal smart devices, it's nothing without having some sense of who you are, which we do in a very kludgy manner right now. Your phone is only useful because it connects to your services, your accounts. We're going to go one step further, where everything can behave differently because it knows who you are. And one of the the thing we hear about all the time is standards, and let's follow standards. It was in the keynote this morning. So Bionym has recently joined the FIDO Alliance. This stuff will not happen unless we cooperate and follow standards. So we follow that. It is a very important paradigm to follow. And that's it for me. Thank you. Any questions? Oh, one. So the question was, have we deployed it? So we're actually starting to deploy it now. We're using it in very controlled environments right now. We're going to a full consumer release in the fall. I don't actually have one with me. We have about, in the office, we have a few, and they don't even let me take them out because we're still testing them. We're just ramping up manufacturing now. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. So we, of course, encrypt the biometric data with a key that is stored in a secure element on the wristband. So all of that stays completely local. Something that is coming down the line, which would raise the bar even higher, which is a concept called biometric encryption. If you think of sort of best practices for storing password, which is you hash it, you salt it, that's very hard to do for biometrics because biometrics matching is not bit for bit the same and hashing doesn't work. We have a technology that allows us to achieve the same effects so that we, at the end of the day, we don't even store biometric information that can be decrypted to the original biometric. That's coming down the line. But I think what's really important is that at the end of the day, it's not going into any sort of centralized database that becomes a great target for breaches. We're big advocates of keeping that completely local to reduce the surface of attack. Yep, for sure. So this is where the opt-in protocol that we've defined comes in. Oh yeah, so the question was how do we avoid just scanners essentially scanning without permission information coming off of the Bluetooth? And the answer is that in the design of the protocol, there's a challenge response protocol there where first of all, you have to provision a new identity credential with which every service you pair with. A passive scanner or even active scanner that tries to talk with you, the wristband will immediately know that this is not something that has permission to retrieve any credentials because it won't have a secret that that is used to allow that to happen. No, so there's a hardware secure element in there that stores keys. Absolutely. So actually we've partnered with Salesforce. One of the really hugely beneficial applications, one of the ways we view ourselves is kind of the last mile of trust, the connection from whatever the endpoint is to the user. So this, if you're using a computer, there's a way for us to essentially generate a trust chain physically from the person through the endpoint to a cloud service. So we emphasize a lot of physical things, but at the end of the day, this is both for physical and digital interactions. And so any sort of endpoint, as long as it has Bluetooth, we can establish a trust chain from the user all the way to a cloud service.